Guadalcanal, November 1942. Private First Class Joseph Kowalski crouched in a foxhole carved into mud that smelled like death and rotting vegetation, his Thompson submachine gun across his knees, watching the jungle tree lean 50 yards away ripple in movement that might have been wind or might have been Japanese infantry, preparing another night assault. He'd been on the island for 6 weeks. He'd fired his Thompson in 17 separate engagements. He'd killed men at ranges so close he could see their expressions change from determination to fear to nothing. But tonight was different. Tonight, the ammunition bandolier across his chest wasn't loaded with standard .45 caliber rounds. Tonight, each cartridge in his Thompson held a miniature explosive charge, a fragment of dynamite compressed into brass casing, designed to detonate on impact with enough force to shatter bone, tear through cover, and ignite anything flammable within 3 feet of the strike point. The rounds had been issued 2 hours earlier by a supply sergeant who wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, who'd handed them over with a warning scrawled on a piece of cardboard. Experimental ammunition. Use at own risk. Report all malfunctions immediately. Kowalski had loaded them anyway, because standard rounds weren't winning this war. Standard rounds punched holes in men who kept fighting. Standard rounds didn't stop banzai charges. Standard rounds didn't make the enemy afraid. And fear, Kowalski had learned in 6 weeks of hell, was the only weapon that actually mattered in jungle warfare, where visibility was 10 feet and death came screaming out of the darkness with bayonets fixed. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. The idea hadn't come from ordnance officers or weapons designers or any official military research program. It had come from desperation, from Marines and Army infantrymen bleeding out in tropical mud, trying to find any advantage against an enemy who didn't retreat, didn't surrender, and fought with a fanaticism that rendered standard infantry tactics obsolete. The Pacific Theater wasn't Europe. There were no front lines, no clear objectives, just islands covered in jungle so thick that artillery couldn't penetrate the canopy, where air support couldn't see targets, where tank support couldn't maneuver, and infantry fought at ranges measured in yards rather than hundreds of meters. In that environment, the Thompson submachine gun had become the primary weapon for close-quarters combat, reliable, devastating at short range, capable of laying down suppressive fire that could hold a position against superior numbers. But it had limitations. The .45 caliber round, while powerful for a pistol cartridge, lacked penetration. It couldn't punch through the thick vegetation that turned every engagement into a point-blank knife fight. It couldn't destroy the log bunkers Japanese engineers constructed with terrifying efficiency. And it couldn't break the psychological grip that Japanese propaganda had on their soldiers, the belief that death in combat was honorable, that surrender was unthinkable, that one Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans. Field commanders needed something more, something that didn't just wound or kill, but that shattered enemy morale, something that made Japanese infantry hesitate before charging, something that turned the Thompson from a suppression weapon into a demolition tool. The first experiments happened in late September 1942 on a transport ship carrying Marines toward Guadalcanal. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Webb, a career Marine who'd served in Nicaragua and China, was examining captured Japanese ammunition when he noticed something unusual. Some of the rifle cartridges had been modified with small explosive tips, designed to detonate on impact with enough force to wound multiple soldiers if it struck ammunition or equipment. The modification was crude, unreliable, and violated the Hague Convention's prohibition on exploding bullets. But it worked. Webb sat in the ship's armory for 3 hours, studying those captured rounds, disassembling them, measuring the explosive content, calculating whether a similar modification could be applied to American .45 caliber ammunition. The chemistry was straightforward. A small amount of nitroglycerin-based dynamite, no more than 1/10 gram, press into a hollowed-out bullet tip and seal with wax. The primer would ignite the powder charge normally, but on impact, the dynamite would detonate from the kinetic shock, creating a small explosion that amplified the round's effectiveness exponentially. Webb wasn't a chemist. He wasn't an engineer, but he'd spent 20 years around explosives, demolitions, and improvised weapons. He understood that war wasn't won by following regulations. It was won by men willing to break them when survival demanded it. He brought the idea to his commanding officer, a lieutenant colonel who'd lost 40 men in the first week on Guadalcanal, and was willing to consider anything that might reduce casualties. The colonel listened, asked 3 questions about safety and legality, and gave Webb permission to produce a test batch of 50 rounds. Webb worked through the night in a makeshift workshop on Guadalcanal, using dynamite sticks pilfered from the engineers, a drill press salvaged from a crashed aircraft, and bullet-making dies borrowed from the ship's gunsmith. He hollowed out 50 .45 caliber rounds, packed each one with dynamite, sealed them with melted candle wax, and loaded them into Thompson magazines. At dawn, he took them to a firing range improvised from sandbags and palm logs, mounted Thompson on a fixed rest, and fired at a target 30 feet away. The first round detonated with a crack that was sharper, louder than a standard shot. The target, a section of palm log 8 inches in diameter, exploded, with fragments flew outward like shrapnel. The impact crater was 3 inches deep. Webb fired again, and again. By the 10th round, he'd reduced the palm log to splinters. By the 20th round, he'd blown a hole clean through a stack of sandbags. And by the 50th round, he knew he created something that would either save lives or court-martial him, possibly both. The first combat test happened on October 4th, 1942, during a Japanese counterattack on Henderson Field. A squad of Marines was pinned down by a machine gun, nest dug into a coral ridge. Standard procedure would have been to call for mortar support or flank the position, but the Marines were under heavy fire, casualties mounting, and the machine gun was shredding anyone who tried to move. Sergeant Webb, who'd accompanied the squad specifically to test his modified ammunition, loaded a Thompson with dynamite rounds and crawled forward through knee-high grass that provided concealment but no cover. He reached a position 20 yards from the machine gun nest, braced the Thompson against his shoulder, and fired a sustained burst directly at the logs protecting the enemy position. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The dynamite rounds detonated on impact, blowing fist-sized chunks out of logs, igniting the dry wood, sending shrapnel into the gun crew. The machine gun fell silent. The Marines advanced, cleared the position, found 3 Japanese soldiers dead from explosion trauma rather than bullet wounds. One had been killed by a splinter driven through his chest with enough force to penetrate his rib cage. Another had severe burns from ignited gunpowder. The third had simply been torn apart by the combined force of multiple detonations striking within seconds of each other. Webb examined the bodies, the destroyed position in the shattered logs, and realized that he hadn't just modified ammunition. He'd turned a submachine gun into a close-range artillery piece. The after-action report reached division headquarters that evening. Effective against fortified positions. Extreme damage to organic cover. Significant psychological impact on enemy forces. Recommend further testing and production. Within a week, Webb was producing 200 dynamite rounds per day in a workshop that had expanded to include 3 assistants, a dedicated supply of dynamite from the engineers, and unofficial approval from a command structure desperate enough to overlook the legal and ethical implications of explosive bullets. By November, every rifle company on Guadalcanal had at least 2 Marines carrying Thompsons loaded with dynamite rounds. And the Japanese, who'd been monitoring radio traffic and interrogating prisoners, had started reporting encounters with a new American weapon they called Bakuhatsu Akuma, Boom Devil. Kowalski hadn't believed the stories when he first heard them. He'd been a factory worker from Pittsburgh, drafted in early 1942, trained at Paris Island, and shipped to the Pacific with the conviction that modern warfare was about discipline, tactics, and superior firepower. The idea that someone would stuff dynamite into bullets and fire them from a submachine gun sounded like a fevered dream, something invented by men who'd been in the jungle too long, men who'd started seeing things that weren't there. But then he'd seen the ammunition, felt the weight of the rounds, slightly heavier than standard because of the explosive filling, seen the wax seal at the bullet tip, and he'd understood that desperation had its own logic, a logic that didn't care about conventions or regulations or what was supposed to be possible. He'd test-fired the round that afternoon, aimed at a coconut tree 40 feet away. The first shot had punched through the trunk and detonated inside, blowing the tree apart from within. The second shot had ignited the dry husk, setting it on fire. The third shot had shattered the trunk completely, toppling the tree. Kowalski had lowered the Thompson, stared at what he'd done, and felt something close to fear. Not fear of the enemy, fear of the weapon in his hands. Because this wasn't a gun anymore. This was something else. Something that existed at the intersection of desperation and ingenuity. Something that should have been impossible, but was real because men like Webb had decided that survival mattered more than rules. The jungle treeline erupted. Japanese infantry burst from the vegetation in a screaming wave, bayonets fixed, officers waving swords, the banzai charge doctrine that had terrified American forces since the war began. Kowalski's squad opened fire with standard ammunition, rifles cracking, Browning automatic rifles hammering out bursts, but the enemy kept coming, absorbing casualties, trampling their own dead, driven by training and fanaticism and the belief that dying in combat was the highest honor. Kowalski waited, let them close to 30 yards, 20 yards, 15 yards. Then he stood, leveled his Thompson, and fired. The dynamite rounds tore into the charge like a circular saw through flesh. Men didn't just fall. They came apart. The bullets detonated on impact with bone, with equipment, with the wooden stocks of their rifles. Each detonation a miniature grenade, creating secondary fragmentation from shattered gear and splintered weapons. A Japanese soldier charging directly at Kowalski took 3 rounds to the chest. All 3 detonated simultaneously. The man's torso simply disintegrated, a wet explosion of blood and bone fragments that sprayed the soldiers behind him. Another soldier, struck in the leg, went down as a round detonated inside his thigh, shattering the femur and tearing to the femoral artery with an eruption of blood that painted the ground red. A third soldier, hit in his rifle, watched his weapon explode in his hands. Wooden stock turned to shrapnel that tore into his face and throat. The charge broke, not because of casualties. Japanese units had absorbed worse. It broke because of the sound, the impossible rapid-fire crack of explosions that shouldn't have come from a submachine gun. Because of the effect, soldiers not just dying but being destroyed, weapons detonating, bodies tore apart in ways that rifle fire couldn't achieve. Because of the psychological realization that they weren't charging into rifle fire. They were charging into something that violated every expectation of how combat worked. The surviving Japanese soldiers retreated into the jungle, leaving behind 17 bodies in a silence broken only by Kowalski's ragged breathing and the ringing in his ears. His squad stared at him, at the bodies, at the Thompson in his hands, smoke rising from both barrels, the smell of burned dynamite mixing with cordite and blood. One of the riflemen, a kid from Iowa barely 20 years old, whispered, "What the hell was that?" Kowalski didn't answer, couldn't answer, because he didn't know what to call what he'd just done. It wasn't shooting. It was something else. Something closer to demolitions than infantry combat. Something that had stopped the banzai charge cold, but it also left him feeling like he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But it had worked. And in November 1942 on Guadalcanal, working was the only metric that mattered. The dynamite round spread through Marine and Army units with the speed of any effective innovation in wartime. No official distribution, no formal training, just word of mouth. Soldiers telling soldiers, sergeants telling sergeants, until every unit that could get their hands on a modified ammunition was using it. Webb's workshop expanded into a production facility, staffed by Marines who'd been engineers or machinists in civilian life, producing 500 rounds per day by mid-November, 1,000 rounds per day by December. The chemistry improved. The wax seal was replaced with a brass crimp that was more reliable. The dynamite charge was standardized to 0.12 grams, enough to guarantee detonation without risking catastrophic weapon failure. And the ammunition started showing up in official reports, disguised as standard .45 caliber to avoid awkward questions from headquarters about Hague Convention violations. But there were problems. The dynamite rounds were unstable. Temperature fluctuations caused premature detonations. Moisture compromised the seals. And rough handling could set off the explosive charge without firing the round, resulting in a magazine detonation that killed the soldier carrying it. The first such incident happened on November 18th. A Marine corporal was moving through dense jungle when he tripped over a root fell hard, and the impact triggered the dynamite in 3 rounds loaded in his Thompson magazine. The explosion blew off his left hand, shredded his lower abdomen, and set his ammunition belt on fire. He died before a corpsman could reach him. 2 more similar incidents occurred in the next week. Command started receiving reports about the ammunition's instability, about the danger posed not just to the enemy, but to the men carrying it. Webb knew the rounds were dangerous. He'd known from the beginning, but he also knew that every weapon was dangerous. And the question wasn't whether it could kill you, but whether it killed more of them than it did of you. The dynamite rounds had stopped charges that would have overrun positions. They destroyed bunkers that mortars couldn't reach. They broken enemy morale in a way that standard firepower couldn't. 3 Marines had died from accidental detonations. But Webb calculated that the ammunition had saved at least 50 lives in the same period by ending fights faster, by stopping charges earlier, by making the enemy hesitate. The math was cold, but war was colder. He implemented new handling protocols. Dynamite rounds were to be loaded into magazines only immediately before combat. They were to be stored separately from standard ammunition, in padded containers away from heat and moisture. Soldiers carrying them were to avoid falls, impacts, or rough movement. And if a magazine was dropped, it was to be treated as live ordnance and disposed of by engineers. The protocols reduced accidents but didn't eliminate them, because in jungle warfare, you couldn't avoid falls. You couldn't avoid impacts. The terrain guaranteed it. Every step was a root or a hole or mud that grabbed your boots and threw you forward. And every fall was a gamble that the rounds in your magazine wouldn't detonate and kill you before the enemy got the chance. Kowalski carried his dynamite rounds with the same care he'd once reserved for his father's hunting rifle, the expensive one that came out once a year for deer season, the one you didn't drop or scratch or treat roughly because it was valuable. But the dynamite rounds weren't valuable. They were deadly in both directions. And every time he moved, every time he climbed or crawled or jumped into a foxhole, he was aware of the weight on his chest, the bandolier holding magazines that could explode if he landed wrong. It changed how he fought, made him more cautious, more deliberate. And in a strange way, that caution kept him alive, because the Marines who treated the dynamite rounds casually were the ones who died from accidents, while the Marines who respected the danger survived long enough to use them effectively. The Japanese response to the dynamite rounds was confusion followed by terror, followed by a kind of fatalistic superstition. Early intelligence reports described the ammunition as a new type of explosive bullet, which was technically accurate, but missed the psychological dimension. Japanese soldiers who survived encounters with dynamite round Thompsons reported that the weapons were cursed, that they fired demon bullets that exploded with supernatural force, that the Americans had made deals with evil spirits to create ammunition that violated the natural order. Propaganda officers tried to counter these beliefs with rational explanations about chemistry and explosives. But rationality didn't help when you'd watched your squad mate's rifle explode in his hands or seen a man's chest cavity turn inside out from a single bullet impact. The name Boom Devil spread through Japanese units on Guadalcanal and beyond. It appeared in captured diaries, in intercepted radio messages, in interrogation transcripts. Some entries described it as a weapon. Others described it as a curse. One diary, recovered from a dead Japanese lieutenant in December 1942, included a passage that American translators found both chilling and oddly sad. We are told to fear tanks and artillery and bombs from the sky, but I fear the Boom Devil most, because it is carried by a single man, and you cannot see it until it has already killed you. And when it kills you, it takes your body and your weapon and your spirit all at once. There is no honor in death by Boom Devil. There is only destruction. That psychological impact was, in many ways, more valuable than the ammunition's tactical effectiveness. Japanese infantry started hesitating before banzai charges. They started breaking off attacks earlier. They started avoiding close-quarters combat with American units known to carry the dynamite rounds. And in jungle warfare, where morale and aggression were often more decisive than firepower, that hesitation created openings, created opportunities, created the margins of survival that American forces desperately needed. But the cost was real. By January 1943, 12 Marines had been killed by accidental detonations of dynamite rounds. Another 30 had been injured, some losing hands or fingers, others suffering burns or shrapnel wounds. And the psychological cost was harder to measure. Soldiers carrying dynamite rounds lived with constant low-level fear, the knowledge that they were carrying something that could kill them at any moment through no fault of their own. That fear accumulated, wore on nerves already frayed by jungle combat, by disease, by the endless cycle of night attacks and day patrols, and never knowing when the next bullet would come. Kowalski felt it, woke up every morning and checked his magazines to make sure none of the rounds had deteriorated overnight, moved through the jungle with exaggerated care, testing each step before committing his weight, avoiding anything that might jar the ammunition. And every time he fired the Thompson, every time those dynamite rounds roared downrange and tore apart whatever they hit, he felt a mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that they'd worked, that he was still alive, that the enemy was dead instead of him. Guilt because he knew that what he was doing violated something fundamental, some unwritten rule about how war was supposed to be fought, some line between legitimate combat and something darker. But the line kept moving. Every week brought new horrors, new innovations, new ways that desperation forced men to abandon principles they thought were absolute. The Japanese used poison gas. The Americans used flamethrowers. The Japanese executed prisoners. The Americans stopped taking prisoners. And somewhere in that descent, dynamite rounds fired from a Thompson submachine gun stopped seeming like an atrocity and started seeming like just another tool, no worse and no better than anything else being used to kill other human beings in a jungle that didn't care about morality or conventions or who was right. By February 1943, the dynamite round had killed an estimated 300 Japanese soldiers and destroyed dozens of fortified positions. They'd also killed 14 Americans through accidental detonation and injured 47 more. The mathematics suggested they were effective. The casualty reports suggested they were dangerous. And the command structure, caught between the need for effective weapons and the reality of friendly fire casualties, issued a directive that satisfied no one. Dynamite rounds were authorized for use, but would not be officially acknowledged, produced under informal arrangements, distributed through unofficial channels, and never mentioned in any report that might reach Washington or the press. It was war's oldest compromise. Use what works. Don't talk about it. Let the men in the field make the hard decisions, and then pretend those decisions never happened. Webb received the directive and laughed, a bitter sound that had nothing to do with humor. He'd spent 4 months producing illegal ammunition, watching men die from his invention, and now command was telling him to keep doing it, but to do it quietly. He almost refused, almost shut down the workshop, destroyed the remaining dynamite rounds, and let someone else figure out how to fight the Japanese without weapons that violated international law. But he didn't, because every week brought letters from rifle companies thanking him for the ammunition, because he'd visited field hospitals and talked to wounded Marines who'd survived, because dynamite rounds had stopped a charge that would have overrun their position, because war wasn't about moral purity. It was about bringing your people home. And if that required making ammunition that killed messily and dangerously and in ways that would horrify civilians, then that was a price. Webb had made his peace with that price months ago. Kowalski used his last dynamite rounds on February 21st, 1943, during the final stages of the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese forces were evacuating, pulling back on the covered night, but pockets of resistance remained, dug into positions they'd held for months, determined to die rather than surrender. Kowalski's squad was tasked with clearing a bunker complex on a ridgeline overlooking the coast. Standard explosives had failed to penetrate the reinforced logs. Artillery couldn't reach the reverse slope, and direct assault had already cost 2 Marines their lives. Kowalski volunteered to go in with the Thompson and dynamite rounds, not because he wanted to, but because he was the only one in the squad who'd used them enough to trust his aim, to know exactly how close he needed to get before firing. He approached the bunker from below. Crawling through mud and roots, the Thompson slung across his back, a satchel charge in one hand in case the ammunition didn't work. He reached the entrance, a narrow gap between logs barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. He could hear Japanese voices inside, low and urgent, preparing for whatever came next. He pulled the Thompson around, checked the magazine one final time, and then stepped into the opening and fired. The dynamite rounds detonated inside the confined space with sound like thunder compressed into a metal box. The log shattered. The roof collapsed, and the bunker, which had withstood mortar fire and grenades and flamethrowers, simply ceased to exist. Kowalski stumbled backward, deafened, covered in splinters and dirt, his Thompson empty, the barrel too hot to touch. He sat down hard, ears ringing, and realized he was done. Not just with the fight, with the dynamite rounds, with the Thompson, with all of it. He'd used the most destructive close-quarters weapon of the Pacific War and survived, and he never wanted to touch it again. His squad cleared the wreckage, found 6 Japanese soldiers dead from a combination of explosion trauma and structural collapse. The bunker complex was secured. The ridgeline was taken, and Kowalski, sitting in the mud, staring at the Thompson across his knees, understood that he'd crossed a threshold that he couldn't return from. He'd used a weapon that shouldn't have existed. He'd killed men in ways that would haunt him for the rest of his life. And he'd done it because war had demanded it, because survival had required it, because there was no other choice that made sense in the moment. The dynamite rounds were quietly phased out after Guadalcanal, not because they didn't work, because improved weapons made them unnecessary. Flamethrowers became more reliable. Explosive charges became more powerful. Infantry tactics evolved to incorporate better combined arms support. And the legal questions, the questions about Hague Convention violations and war crimes, started becoming harder to ignore as the war moved closer to victory, and people started thinking about what would happen after the shooting stopped. The remaining stockpiles were destroyed or lost in the chaos of island-hopping campaigns. The production facility on Guadalcanal was dismantled, and the men who'd carried the dynamite rounds, men like Kowalski, went home and never spoke about them. Not because they were ashamed, because no one who hadn't been there, who hadn't felt the weight of a magazine that could explode at any moment, who hadn't seen what those rounds did to human bodies, could understand why they'd seemed like a good idea at the time. Webb survived the war, retired as a master gunnery sergeant in 1948, moved to California, and spent the rest of his life working as a machinist. He never wrote about the dynamite rounds, never gave interviews, never acknowledged his role in creating one of the most controversial infantry weapons of World War II. But once in 1967, during a reunion with other Guadalcanal veterans, someone asked him if the stories about Boom Devil were true. Webb was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We did what we had to. Would I do it again? Yes. Am I proud of it? No. But pride doesn't matter when you're trying to keep 19-year-olds alive in a jungle where everything is trying to kill them. You use what works. You deal with the consequences later." That was the only public acknowledgement he ever made, and it was enough, because the men in that room understood. They'd been there. They'd made similar choices, used similar weapons, crossed similar lines, and they knew that judging those decisions from the safety of peacetime California was pointless. The dynamite rounds had existed because they needed to exist. They'd been used because standard ammunition wasn't enough. And they'd been forgotten because remembering them required confronting truths about warfare that most people preferred to ignore. Kowalski lived until 1994, worked in a steel mill after the war, raised 4 children, never told his family what he'd done on Guadalcanal. But sometimes late at night, when he couldn't sleep, he'd sit on his porch and remember the sound of those dynamite rounds detonating. The way they'd torn through logs and flesh with equal ease, the way they'd ended fights before they'd really begun. And he'd think about the men he'd killed with them, the Japanese soldiers who died not from bullets, but from miniature explosions, and he'd wonder if they'd known what hit them, if they'd had time to be afraid, if they'd understood that the weapon killing them was as terrifying to the man firing it as it was to them. He never found answers. But he carried the questions until the end, because that was the cost of weapons like the dynamite rounds. Not just what they did to the enemy, what they did to the men who used them, the weight they left on souls that could never quite put it down. The legacy of the dynamite rounds is almost invisible. No military historians write about them. No museums display them. No official records acknowledge their existence beyond vague references in after-action reports that describe modified ammunition or experimental ordnance. But the men who carried them, The few who are still alive and the many who've passed on, they remember. They remember the sound, the effect, the fear, and they remember that sometimes innovation in warfare isn't about making better tools. It's about making tools desperate enough to match the desperation of the moment. The dynamite rounds were never the future of infantry combat. They were a snapshot of a specific time, a specific place, a specific level of desperation where men were willing to try anything, risk anything, violate anything if it meant one more day of survival. And in that sense, they succeeded. They weren't elegant. They weren't safe. They weren't something anyone would have designed in peacetime or used if better options existed. But they worked. For a few months in late 1942 and early 1943, they gave American infantry an edge in jungle combat that standard weapons couldn't provide. They stopped charges. They destroyed positions. They broke enemy morale. And they kept men like Kowalski alive long enough to go home. Even if home was haunted by memories of what they'd had to do to get there. If the story moved your heart even once, subscribe. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below. It's the least tribute we can give to men like them.